Anyway.
You're
Have an unremarkable.
remarkable. When you see a neurologist, they'll look and they'll tell you if they see any signs of migraines or.
Don't ever have done.
Been a while.
They laugh. For me, because I'm so clean, and it's bringing health and everything. That they, that's me. I'm always there. Anyway, they get in my system. They just. What do you eat?
The time?
Oh, the volume, I've never. Talking about the dye for the contrast. But
No.
you just have to.
Oh. That is my car from the air conditioner. Let's do it now.
I'm glad you don't have a brain hair.
Kick it. Boom. You have to say it right. Like Merle said. I don't have a boom.
We are very glad.
Y'all doing?
We're good.
Haven't seen you breathe, though. All at one time. Well,
We
then,
don't fight.
but if I did, I'm gonna turn my chair around that way. I can leave it 3 pretty.
Still at it.
I'm so good at that. Bob would say, Palmer, I'd be like, Bob, here's your choice. I can look at you.
And you would say, he'd let you get away.
He'll probably someone. Yeah, I'll be back in a minute. I used to get a pen and. Glass, get to the bar.
Good idea. I've ignored this. $5. You're all bottom of my butt. Hey.
Yeah, my baby.
Hey. Hey.
And I printed out.
Let's see, you gonna see him? It's time to top. You running for mayor.
Mayor, who don't.
I wish he would run for president because I'm gonna do a write-in vote this year. I don't like anybody who's running. I got a 1:30 doctor's appointment. I'm gonna be here short. Okay, but I'm not running. Fair enough. I'm happy to have you as long as you can be here. Jesus. Thanks. That's me. He's called, please. Yeah. Tell me. You're not teaching.
I know, yeah. Okay, so y'all don't want me teaching this class.
So they don't think you're okay. But you know, most people tell you get this out of it.
Well, but realize.
Yeah. But you can tell Randall to expect her to last more.
Oh, and so they're going to be over like the. Quiet. Yeah. Everybody understand. Being
Good. How's it going with you? Better than terrible.
Checking next week. It was with Lisa. Yeah. Hey. Yeah, how are you? But.
I. Yeah. Well, she's working on copies. Those are some I put up there. You just had 3. However many more, you can see we ended up with more people than anticipated. So. Hey, Bob, is this class authored by Jim Gary? You betcha. Let's see. We might just say for whatever, since we got more than we thought, just make copies of that first section. Before you get to the contracts and all. You know what I'm talking about? Well, let me show you. If you were making so it'd be easier to make copies. Yeah.
I didn't print the contract.
Section.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You depend.
Yeah.
So
Yes, fight for the back seat. Jeff or Tommy, did you read the email about making copies before you came to class? Yeah, I gotta do it. But have to answer. No, that's something. I didn't do it. So better. No, you go. Yes. She's gonna make copies of that first section. Because you guys have memorized the contracts anyway, it's not a problem. That would be 2 Yes, exactly. Like we got a transaction going on right now for how they're using it, so, can we just make copies of that first section?
I'm working on it. Give me 5 minutes, I'm sorry.
Okay, probably about 15, 20 copies. Just that first section.
Have you changed your profile picture?
Must have.
You look a little younger.
Okay, leave her alone, let her go make copies of the handout. Thank you, Lucy. No, I haven't here. Yes, sir. Yeah, I see you. How are you? You get an award? But any day now, right?
Yeah.
Good. A lot of work we gave out.
Like,
Okay, while she's working on copies of the handout here, let's talk about the topic of what we're gonna deal with. And as we get into the contract and select addenda themselves, you know, most of these are areas that you may have memorized somewhat familiar with the concept, so we'll probably be able to work through it. So let's talk a little bit about the topic of what we're talking about, except for what Larry was thinking. I said, wow, this is great. I can learn how to do dirty tricks all day long. No, not really. So first of all, let's talk about the concepts. And I'm kind of throwing out a little bit about what we mean by negotiation dirty tricks. So just make them an idea what we think that is.
That's unanticipated that gives the other side a clear advantage.
Okay, so that can just be any negotiation. Throw in the concept of dirty tricks. What are we talking about? I mean, any negotiation, one person's objective is to create an edge, a leverage in that negotiation. Okay, so here's the concept. And we'll find that there are two sides to this. When you get the handout, we've got 3 factors involved in the dirty tricks of negotiation. First one is lying or misinformation. Where the people on the other side, maybe it's the buyer or seller, maybe it's the agent, it's just out and out lying to gain that advantage that Cynthia talks about. The second is manipulation. And the third is emotion and making use of emotion. Those 3 areas. Every negotiation, and remember, as I kind of mentioned in the team meeting, we're all negotiating all the time. We negotiate with our spouse, we negotiate with our children, we negotiate with each other, and we negotiate with ourselves. In fact, that's the most constant and the hardest negotiation you do is with yourself. Without even recognizing that's what you're doing. You know, nice, chilly, rainy morning, you're negotiating yourself to get up. Sometimes that's a hard negotiation. I really don't have any appointments yet, so I don't really have to get up yet. So we're doing that negotiation. But in every negotiation, you've got the 2 primary elements. You've got the goal of the negotiation, whatever the goal may be. And then you've got a strategy to arrive at that goal. Now, the goal itself can change during the process of negotiation. Because as you negotiate, as you use your strategy, as you negotiate, you may discover new information, or the other side may give up some important points. And you say, you know, I thought we could get this for 450,000, but I think we can get it for 430,000. You may, change really what you think you can achieve as you work through it. But in every negotiation, as you go through it, for example, lying and misinformation is always a dirty trick. There's not another side to that. When you provide information, if you intend to, and if you deliberately provide misinformation, that's a dirty trick. And the reason you're providing that misinformation, you're lying about it, is to do what? Like, let's say the other side is giving you information. You're the buyer's agent and you're talking to the listing agent and you want to get some information about an offer that you're going to send for your buyer. What could be lying or misinformation from the listing agent that they feel like might give them some leverage? Multiple offers. The most common thing is listing agent says, you know, I do have 2 other offers, or I do have another offer, I do have whatever. And so if your buyer has any hope at this, they gotta get really serious. I mean, they gotta come with real numbers. That's misinformation. And it's a dirty trick. And it's done to gain leverage. It's done for that listing agent to create a sense of urgency and to make you do things. How do you deal with that as a buyer's agent? Do you care?
No.
You really don't, do you? Doesn't matter if there are other offers. Even though you've got a competition factor that comes into play, and your buyer, if they truly do have competition with other offers, it may change how they go through the process and make the offer and do it. But your buyer should be making their best offer anyway. They should be making their most attractive offer, and they should be making an offer that's not more than what it's worth to them, what's really a good offer for them, and you'll help them develop that. The second of those is manipulation. And manipulation actually has 2 sides. One, you could be manipulating in a disingenuous manner, take advantage, and who we see do this a lot are type A aggressive people who are manipulating based on how they're dominating the situation. We also see this in the third one with emotion. However, there's a good side to manipulation, and it's persuasion. Go through the process, you know, Larry, you do a good job of this. You establish that relationship with the agent on the other side, and it enhances your ability to persuade as you go through the process. And persuasion is a good thing as long as it's not done with an evil or a bad intent. You work through that. So it looks like she's come in with some copies of the handout, and let's give Lucy a hand for helping. You just have other things she needs to do other than babysit Bob. Appreciate that. The emotion, the third factor of emotion. The transaction we deal with, particularly the residential transaction, we deal, even with investors. You know, people say, well, it's an investor, it's totally cut and dry, it's just dollars. Well, it's not. There's emotion into it. And so where you get into a dirty trick with emotion is the inappropriate use of emotion. You take advantage of someone's emotion in the situation. You know, for example, if you found out the seller had certain circumstances dealing with selling the property. Maybe, for example, there was a divorce situation, a death on the property, something that caused the seller to have a lot of emotions in selling the property. Then will that change how the buyer can negotiate the transaction with the seller? Sure. And the way you use that could be a dirty trick, could be inappropriate use of that emotion as you work through that. So you have double sides there. If you've got the handout now, does everybody have the handout? Or you have access to it? You've got it on your device? Everybody have it? You have it? So do we have some more back here? We have a young man.
Yeah.
Raise your hand. And all we're looking at is this first set here of handout on contract negotiations. Tricks. And this will take us into parts of the contract and selected it. So we'll work through that. So the primary reason, and I mentioned it a couple of times, that we learn about dirty tricks is when it's used against us. The hardest thing is to recognize the intent behind the dirty trick. Sometimes it wasn't intentional. They're not a bad person. They're not a mean person. Sometimes, you know, that's just how they are. You may have a transaction with the other person on the other side. Honestly, feels like, you know, my whole reason for being is to take care of my client. And I'll bury you to take care of my client. One of my early lessons, without getting any religion or whatever like that, I'm a backseat Baptist, all my life kind of thing. And a rude awakening for me was the business meeting of deacons in a Baptist church. And how far they would go to protect God's money. I mean, they would nail you to the wall to protect God's money. And I go, wow, and that's kind of tough. But they have this mission behind them. Well, we have that with agents. We have agents who just take very seriously, you know what? If it didn't work out for your client, that's your problem, and that's your client's problem. I'm taking care of my client. That's not how it should be. One of the things that good agents do is they go through the process, they establish a good relationship with the other side, and they're all working together to make this thing work. And neither is taking undue advantage of the other going through the process. Because one of the things we recognize as we go through all the negotiation is the more we can keep the buyer and the seller feeling good about each other and feeling good about their original promise. Seller promises to sell, buyer promises to buy. As long as we can keep that going, chances are everything is going to get worked out and this thing's going to close. When any of that falls apart, then we've got a challenge to work through that. And one of the things that we've got to be able to do when we recognize a dirty trick is we've got to do whatever we can, not to battle. We're not going to argue with them, but we're going to go through a process to resolve whatever that issue is on behalf of our client, you know, present the proper things to our client and move forward and try to take care of that. When you look on that first page on the handout that you have there, and I talked about the three techniques, the three things here: lying, intentional misinformation, manipulation, and inappropriate use of emotions. And we'll see these as they work through. And we talk about the bad side and the good side. And I've already talked about manipulation, that persuasion is the good side. If you can develop the ability to be persuasive, the greatest challenge is when you recognize that being persuasive with people who you have no authority over. You have no ability to make them do anything, and you're persuading them to voluntarily step up and help everybody out as you go through the process. Most of the time, when you're in that first interaction with the H on the other side, as much as you can, you need to gain a sense of what kind of person they are. Because the kind of person they are will help you determine whether or not this really is a dirty trick, or frankly, it's just who they are. They don't mean anything by it, but they're a very dominant individual. They're a very aggressive individual. They don't mean any disrespect. That's who they are. That kind of person, you can negotiate with them in a different manner and still make it work. What works the most effective in negotiating with a dominant individual is to give him the edge. Yeah, actually, back when I did production, I had a lady on the other side. She was a huge producer in that market area. It was down in the Lake Highlands, East Dallas area. She's huge, big producer. But she was a deal maker. Didn't care about her clients. She cared about deals, and she did a lot of deals. And in the transaction, she was incredibly dominant. We had a situation where it was a husband and wife who owned the property, but the wife owned the property prior to marriage. And only the wife was on the contract. And our buyer appropriately said, no, homestead state, got to have both of them. They both have to sign off. They both have to transfer title, requires both of them. And the listing agent, remember her objective here, doing deals. Listing agent said, no, Bob, I do this all the time. Don't worry about it. Closing, we get this taken care of. I do this all the time. It's, trust me on this. Well, she was wrong. I said, you know, oh, boy, I'm glad, you know, I can't tell you how fortunate I am to be dealing with somebody with your experience. This is gonna be great. Thank you so very much. But my buyer, by the way, also happens to be an attorney. Because here's what he needs to move forward. And her objective was to get this house sold. So if that's what needed to be done to get this thing done, she was gonna make it work. In spite of the fact that she had a problem, we talked later, she said, she had a real problem with the buyer, with the wife buyer who owned the property prior to marriage. She said, no. I own the house before we got married. I still own the house now. I'll own the house when we're no longer married, which doesn't speak well for the marriage, but. But she said, yeah, I understand that, but here's how it happened. But you defer to it. You don't argue with it. You don't say, well, you know, you're wrong, and here's what the law says. Like, you don't do that. You know, you let them do it while you're maintaining control. And so you go through that process. Because folks that are operating on that level, they don't even realize that's what they're doing. It's so much a part of who they are and their personality. That's just secondhand to them. They just go through the process. And the more you get out of the way and let them do their thing, because what they'll do is they'll help their client get this deal done, because in her case, she wants to get a deal done. That's just her objective. In fact, we had a situation aside from the Homestead thing that our buyer had a house for sale. And this was a time when there were multiple offers. And we really were concerned that with our buyer making a contingency offer, that this really tough. But I mean, it just sailed right through. The agent didn't care, because why? Agent wanted to get the deal done. She does production, and that's her life. She does production. Doesn't matter if it's to the best interest of her client or not, she's going to do deals. And once I picked up on who she is, how she does business, you make use of it and you work through that process. So you kind of deal with that. Go over to the second page of your handout. Various elements of the 23 paragraphs. And we're going to look at some of the paragraphs and some of the kinds of things. I want a lot of interaction from you, because you've got sets of experiences that help you try to decide as you're working through something, what's been used against you, how you effectively made use of it, how you were able to get through the transaction. And the first one is paragraph 1. Now you think, wow, that's pretty simple. Paragraph 1, that's just the party, that's the seller and that's the buyer. What could possibly be going on in paragraph 1 that could create a challenge? What do you think? We got the seller, it's named the seller, it's the name of the buyer. What do you think? What could be going on here that could create a challenge that the other side, and maybe you have the buyer and the listing agent, is using some misinformation in paragraph 1 for some other reason? Because remember, every time somebody does something, if they do it intentionally, and the toughest negotiators out there do this all the time, they're doing this over here to set up a trade-off with this over here. This is not really what they want. This is not really the problem, but they're going to create enough of a situation to finally get to what they really want over here. So let's say, for example, what could a listing agent be doing in paragraph 1 for the seller that could end up being a challenge that we have to address later? And if they agree to this, say, well, okay, but here's what we want. What could they be doing? What?
Looking them up on social media.
Why would the listing agent be looking about, we're talking about the listing agent has a seller and they're giving us misinformation about the seller. Joe?
The listing agent didn't find out who the actual seller is.
Yeah, we may not actually have all the sellers in paragraph 1. We may have to add someone later as you work through the process. We may be dealing with a divorce situation, an estate situation, a trust situation, a power of attorney, and these kinds of things. One of the things that we've got to do is when negotiating a transaction, we have to remember what we're negotiating for our buyer is a contract with the actual person or persons who can come to closing and convey title. We don't always have that first thing out. You know, and it makes it to me, maybe we need to, on the buyer side, go through the process and make sure who we've got here is really who we need to be. What about on the buyer side? What can be done on the buyer side? Jeannie?
I had one years ago where I had the listing and the buyer put a false name. There wasn't, it was like, my seller was really particular about who was gonna buy their house.
Yeah,
And they somehow knew that because they were a neighbor and they put like company name or LLC. or
which a buyer didn't want them to know maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So anyhow, they changed it and it's, I remember asking you about that.
Yeah.
They could do-
And they cannot unilaterally change it. It has to be agreed between both parties. So having the wrong information, having an LLC, having some kind of a corporate entity. If you have, for example, a investor buyer, somebody who's buying under a corporate entity, an LLC, for example. One of the little details that pops up is if you're going to amend paragraph 6A8, amend the survey exception. If it's a residential transaction, the cost is 5% of the premium for title policy. If it's a commercial transaction, it's 15%. If the buyer is buying in an LLC, it just became a commercial transaction. And if they're going to amend that, it's now going to cost 15%. So little other things impact and happen that cause certain things to go. You're going to amend that in 6A8 as you deal with that. So one, misinformation, you have misinformation. And one of our challenges, because we're saying, we understand we got to do this right, and we understand our role in this, is when we get misinformation, one of the first things we've got to do is try to find out why. What are some of the reasons that you could be getting misinformation and even lying from the other side? What are some of the reasons why somebody might give you misinformation about the buyer or the seller?
Possibility of fraud.
Could be a possibility of fraud, and we do have that problem in today's market, fraudulent buyers and fraudulent sellers. And that they're just trying to slip something by as work through it. Ollie?
I was just saying that certain surnames have, trouble.
Cultural connotations that somebody might not want to, sure, absolutely.
That could be,
Uh-huh.
that's.
Yeah.
Must be unfortunate.
Yeah, Janet?
Celebrity status.
Yeah, celebrity or security issues. Maybe it's a high security issue, a criminal court judge, something like that. Or it could be a celebrity kind of thing. Now, those might not be malicious. Those just might be misinformation for good reasons. But when you determine what those are, you need to make sure you see how this impacts on your client. What's going to be the problem? I mean, you say, well, okay, celebrity, okay, that makes sense. They don't want everybody's brother, or they live in the same neighborhood. They don't want the seller to know who I am as the buyer because it'll change the negotiation and what they do. So there may be valid reasons to do that. So your job is to determine, is this a malicious intent or what's going on here? They're lying on purpose. If they're lying on purpose, what it is they're hoping to achieve. Might be a fraud situation, and that's what they're trying to do. They don't own the house. They don't have the money. They're going through the process. Yes, sir.
So if you do have like a celebrity or a security issue, can you go ahead and how soon do you have to disclose who the actual buyer is?
Well, in paragraph 1 of the contract, you have to have someone in there. And if you're going to use some name other than, then you may put a name in there, a POA, an LLC, an and/or signs. What we see with some really top security or celebrity issues is they have their attorney. And their attorney is in there and/or signs. Because at some point in time, legally, who's in paragraph 1 is who has to come to closing. And if it's someone else who's going to buy or go through the process or transfer title to somebody else, then you've got to amend the contract. Title company's going to require it, and if it's financing, lenders will require it. But at the beginning, you have to have some name and some vehicle. You can't put TBD, which means I don't know. So we come up with something.
Well, I mean, my favorite thing is legit up until then. It's like, we'll just say it's a cash offer. So, cash is on the table, we'll have to worry about financing. At what point for closing does the actual buyer have to be disclosed?
Well,
Are you saying,
at the beginning, you have to have a buyer's name.
Right.
And it has to be. And if they want to change it, then it would be prudent for the buyer at the beginning to say Bob Baker and or signage. Letting the seller know that prior to closing, we may change who the actual ultimate buyer is. So they let them know that. Now, this may or may not cloud the offer. Some seller says, oh, no, I want to know who's buying my house. Seller gets to decide that, by the way, as long as he doesn't step over the line and have something that may cause discrimination problems. You know, I want to make sure that those people are buying my house. You know what I'm talking about? You know, those people. Yes, ma'am.
Considering that,
Yeah.
why don't title companies change and request proof of identity from the beginning rather than waiting? Yeah.
The question is, if I have Zoom here, can't hear Janie, why don't title companies require more proof of identities? They're moving in that direction aggressively because they have been dealing with fraudulent buyers and sellers on an increasing level. And so they're taking extra efforts. We're taking extra efforts because this is happening. We've had it happen in this office. We've had it happen in my Rockwall office, both fraudulent buyers and sellers. The buyers is the hardest thing because it's harder to determine until something really pops up. Sellers, in every case, we had 3 fraudulent seller situations. And 2 of them were acreage and the other was a vacant property. And fortunately, we're able to find out when the actual owner of the property called my agent and says, why is your sign on my land? Who the heck are you? Well, I'm your agent. No, you're not. So we discovered it. But on the buyer side, it's not as quick. And Paula, don't you have forewarn? Yeah, and forewarn is a service, and you have, okay, that can help you determine who these people are, because it's an increasing problem. And so in this case, as was pointed out, this is a potential fraud situation. This is intentional. And what we're looking for, especially when you start working with buyers, or not especially, but both cases, when you work with buyers, you need to do as much as you can to determine who they are. You know, ideally, you want a meeting here. You want their ID here. And you want them to give you, let's see your license, whatever. And if they do a lot of business, for example, in Oklahoma, they'll have a passport. And hopefully be current. So, but you need to work through that. The seller who you never get to physically meet, who's doing everything remotely on acreage or vacant property, those little red flags, and you need to take extra efforts. What?
That's a baseball.
Yeah, do some things to really determine, because title companies have a problem with fraudulent sellers showing up with fraudulent documents. We have a problem with buyers showing up with fraudulent cashier's checks. Because cashier's checks can be, fake. So we have to do that. Janet?
And I've even had that on phone calls when someone says, hey, can you pull some comps on my house? I ask them their name and then I go to the tax roll and not anywhere close to their name. I have a son who's gonna try and sell his mother's house out from under her.
Yeah.
Because I checked the tax roll, I said, I'm sorry, I can't discuss this with you because you're not on the deed anymore.
Yeah, the only thing we can, work something like that is, public records, working through things like that. So even in something as simple and pure as paragraph 1, seller and buyer, there's a lot of room for dirty tricks. There's a lot of room for misinformation. And our job is to discover as soon as we can, what's going on here? Why are they doing it? As I mentioned several times, and you'll hear me say it several times, the biggest struggle we have is determining intent. Intent is the hardest thing to determine, but it's the most important thing to determine. Now, when we're determining intent, there's something that we have to deal with. You have to recognize within yourself your natural bias. Because you have a tendency to give people credit or not give people credit based on what they're saying, based on their actions, and you read things into it. We had a really nice husband and wife couple. They've since retired. Good people, kindest people you want to know. Now, when I start off saying things that good, there's a butt coming. He's the most cynical person I know. as kind as they are, he is incredibly cynical. There was a transaction going on and, you know, he had the seller and the buyer, we were negotiating. He said, you know what, I can tell what they're doing. I've seen that before. I mean, they were guilty because in his mind, that's what people do. That's how everybody is. He had a bias towards things that people do. And he says, that's how it is. He didn't recognize his bias, and it gets in the way of him being able to determine someone's intent on why they're doing certain things. All of us have a natural bias. You know, sometimes the bias is based on who we're dealing with. You know, from a cultural standpoint, we all have cultural biases. I mean, it's there. I mean, everybody understands my cultural bias is what? If you're folks know, I tell you what, I'm kind of hard to give you the benefit of the doubt, but it's really hard. I have to spell things out for you. All that bright anyway. But we all do. And so what we've got to do is get past that natural bias as we're looking for intent. Because if you can't get some true intent there, it's a hard thing for you to move forward and negotiate. You really got to, when they do something, you know, you go, wow, was that just nice? That was just persuasion. That was good information. Or were they manipulating? You know, what's really going on here? And then you look for other clues. You will continue to look for more information as you go through the process. The really good agents in this room are really good at that. You're really good at, because you've established good relationship with people on the other side. And that good relationship is going to help you get good, genuine information to be able to make some really good decisions. Anything else you want to add about paragraph 1 before we go to paragraph 2, property? Okay, paragraph 2 in the contract. Remember what happens in paragraph 2, which is cleverly titled property. Everything in paragraph 2 tells us what the seller is conveying to the buyer. This defines the property. Starts off with a legal description and improvements, accessories, and then the exclusions. So everything, because remember the concept is everything the seller owns is conveyed in the sale. And it'll be identified in paragraph 2A, 2B, and 2C, less 2D. And so when we look at this, although occasionally we have a problem with 2A, dealing with the legal description, that's usually a typo or a mistake, or, you know, we have on a regular basis MLS violations because what they have in Netris is not the same as what you have or what the actual has. Aside from that, our bigger challenge is what buyers and sellers think's happening in paragraph 2B, improvements, and 2C, accessories. And the seller thinks, well, I can take this or can't take this, or the buyer says, well, that's got to stay because it's permanently installed and built in, or it's on the list in 2C. So what we have to do is look for clues from the other side. If we've got the buyer, we need to have a sense of what's going on with the seller, what they expect to do, what they expect to keep, what they expect not to keep, and which means that the agent, at least the agent, needs to be really familiar with all the items in 2B and 2C. Because that really tells us this is what's going to go. And if there's anything in 2D, and here's what the seller's going to keep with it. One of our transactions we've got that we're dealing with a situation where the buyer wants to be very clear about what's going on with the seller. It's a property in which the seller has a family friend staying in the property. It's kind of an unofficial. They don't have a lease. They don't even have an oral lease. It's just their family friend. I think it's like a cousin or something like that who's staying in the property right now. And fortunately, at least we know about it. And so the buyer's agent, our agent, we had a buyer, helped the buyer, and the buyer said, okay, I want to make sure that prior to closing, this property is vacant. And originally, the proposal from the buyer was I wanted, vacant, and the seller has removed all personal items, which, as you know, they're not required to do unless we require that. And they use that phrase that I hate the most, not the most, sir, professionally clean. Don't want to be professionally clean. I said, no. Buyer, you need to name the company that's going to clean it and work with the seller on capping the cost, because we can't agree on what professionally clean means. Cynthia?
Go back to what you said about the personal, it's not required that their personal possessions be out by closing.
Not be out at all, period. Seller has no obligation to remove anything. This happens a lot. This doesn't happen once in a blue moon. Buyer closes, its key goes out to the new house, expects to step inside and see a vacant house. And it's full of old dumpy, dirty furniture and washer and dryer, refrigerator with moldy stuff in it. I thought they were supposed to move. Well, they have moved. Why is this stuff here? Well, you didn't require them to move. There is nothing in the contract that requires the seller to remove anything.
So
Anything.
what,
And not required to clean the house. Now, we tend to treat this as a business detail. So the buyer, even with a business detail, which the buyer can create the language for that, the buyer needs to send us an email saying, here's what I want. And the phrase that this buyer used, which was okay, vacant and free of all personal property of the seller. So it's vacant, free of all. Because what he wanted is that family friend to be gone. And we want it done, in this case, 3 days prior to closing. We want all that done prior to. And then we had to make the changes, and here's who we want to have clean the house, and seller, here's the cost, you can cap it at this cost. But you got to remember, nowhere in the contract does it say seller has to remove anything that's there. Seller can leave everything. And if you don't have the conversation with your buyer and the seller hasn't removed it, who's the buyer going to look to? You're getting ready to hire somebody to come out and remove all that junk. Because that's a reasonable expectation, isn't it? And the reason it's reasonable is easily 95% of the time, of the time, that's what happens. Seller takes all their stuff. You have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, so how is that conveyed in the contract?
Paragraph 11, special provisions.
Oh, I was getting ready.
Well-
Now, you've got to have something from the buyer saying, here's what I want. You, the agent, can't create any language, even business detail language. You have to have it from the buyer. And the buyer says, here's what I want. Here's what I want to say in the contract. And we're good. If it slips over the line even a little bit, that affects the legal rights of the parties, then an attorney has to do it. But if we treat it as a business detail and leaving the house vacant, all the personal items removed, if you do that. Now, what you do is you look at it, it's a judgment call. You look at what's going on with the property. Older properties, cluttered properties, a lot of stuff in it. And seller says, if I have to move one more thing, I'll burn this house down. I just don't want to deal with it. And so they start looking, and finally the seller says, listening, it says, we really have to move all this stuff out? Can't we just let the buyer have it? So he says, yeah. You don't have to remove anything. You can let the buyer have all of it. As long as the buyer didn't say something in the contract, you don't have to do it. Oh, sure. That's gonna make moving a lot easier. Wouldn't that make moving a lot easier, Marcia? But we need to understand, now, you gotta make a judgment call. If it's a beautiful, immaculate property, close that day, throw a party that night, you're probably not gonna push making sure the seller is gonna leave with all their gorgeous furniture. But if it's an older dumpy house and there's stuff in there, washer, dryer doesn't work, refrigerator full of moldy food, you're probably gonna have the conversation. You're at least gonna have the conversation with the buyer. Because when you start creating requirements like that, it clouds the offer. And if your buyer's gonna make a really lowball offer, one of the investors that Larry likes to work with and something like that, you might want to be real careful, because anything extra that you push the seller on, am I correct on this? Anything extra you push the seller on could affect the offer.
We were in a hoarder's house yesterday in Branch.
Okay.
We knew the seller passed away and we knew the heirs were not gonna clean out the house.
Okay.
We got that information from the listing agent. So
And so your buyer says, we're okay with it.
we're okay with it. We're lowering our offer $5,000.
Because that's the cost of us removing everything.
Yes.
See, that's a perfect solution to working through that. As you go, because you've got to look at what the parties are doing in paragraph 2 and property, understanding the underlying 2 legal principles. Everything the seller owns is conveyed in the sale. Seller is not required to remove anything.
It had the most roaches I've ever seen.
These are roaches so big, you put a saddle on them and run them around. Big old roaches. Big.
Did not keeping it.
Question, yes, sir.
Would a manipulation tactic be the seller actually trying to skip over moving that stuff out or?
Yeah, and so it could be manipulation on the listing agent seller's part by not addressing it at all. I mean, for example, if you're on the listing side, and you have the sense that your seller is not gonna move anything, that he's gonna, he's gone, he's going to Aruba, says, adios. You're not gonna bring it up. You're not gonna say, buyer say, oh, by the way, you're gonna have to put something in the contract, otherwise he's not removing anything. You're not gonna make that an issue as you work through that. So just one of the things that happens with knowledgeable agents is they make decisions on what's even to be included in the offer of the contract, including which addenda. Because there's some addendums that are far more beneficial to one side than the other side. And you may not even bring that up. For example, as a listing agent, you may not even bring up the fact that it's an unrepresented buyer and he doesn't know what to include or whatever. He may not know to include the major or HOA addendum. And the seller says, well, I don't want to use that addendum because it gives termination rights to the buyer. We'll go ahead and provide the subdivision information, including the resale certificate to the buyer because the title company's going to require it. But we're not going to use that addendum. Well, you don't have to. There are no addenda that have to be used in the transaction. And so seller said, that addendum is really to the benefit of the buyer. We're not going to use it. Third-party finance addendum is required by the buyer's lender, but here are some choices in there that we're going to make use of that are to the benefit of our seller and not to the benefit of the buyer. And so by being knowledgeable about what's in the contract and about the various addenda that are available, especially if you get a transaction and the person on the other side is not represented, maybe a for sale by owner, maybe a buyer is representing themselves. And because you know what can or cannot be used, what doesn't have to be used, you can help structure that offer in that contract to your client's advantage. And that's simply making use of your superior knowledge. It's not a dirty trick. You did not take on the responsibility to educate the other side. You didn't take them on to raise them. It's just, they work through it. So is everybody good with paragraph 2 and what can be happening there? You kind of work, yes, ma'am.
So say you put in there specifically. And putting that, and they say.
Paid to us at a cost of, not to exceed $400, whatever.
So you do your walkthrough and they haven't given you a receipt, they haven't. And then they say they had someone else come in.
Okay, see, and this is a good point. I'm trying to bring this up because this is the problem. As you agree to certain things in the contract, maybe in paragraph 11, special provision, maybe in an amendment. And you made it clear who you want to use. And seller gets capped cost. The seller may say, well, the only thing that's important here is the cost. And I'm going to do whoever I'm going to do. I've got a cousin who has a company and we're going to use them or whatever. Well, that's not what was agreed to in the contract. And then we have a potential dispute and the buyer's got to decide how hard we're going to push this. The buyer does the walkthrough prior to closing and, they will want, because under paragraph 7F of the contract, seller has to provide those receipts. Those are receipts that shows, yeah, here's what was done, things that were agreed to in the contract. We didn't have that before, but we now have that in the contract in paragraph 7F, new language. So the buyer's got to decide, you know what? I think it's what we agreed to do. But sellers do this. We had a challenge and it was a much bigger problem in that our agent had put together, it was a foundation issue. And we had a structural engineer's report, we had a foundation report. We had an amendment in which the seller agreed to have this work done under the specific instructions of this structural engineer, work done by this foundation company. And the seller used a different foundation company, and the seller had a different structural engineer's report they used. We ended up in a lawsuit. No way to protect against the big lie. If they choose to do whatever they choose to do, you got to do it. What we're trying to do is the vast majority of the time is that we kind of check on things to make sure, we're on the same page. Sometimes if you're a little suspicious of the other side, you'll follow up with some emails. I just want to make sure that, you know, as we've agreed, you know, here are the clean people and here's what they've done. So just want to make sure we're on the same page. What's the schedule and then how's it working? Just a little kind, gentle, back and forth feedback kind of thing. Because you need that because people, when they look, says, well, that's not really an agreement. That's just kind of a suggestion. It's just kind of, well, if we want to do that, we might do that, but we don't have to. People think that all the time. It's why we go from that incredibly vague phrase of professionally clean. Because the interpretation of that from the two sides is huge. It's just not even close. And the number of buyers who complain about the house not being clean. And the seller just, you know, work themselves to the bone, trying to clean it. You got a whole family over there all day long cleaning it. And they say it's great. And the buyer says, hey, guys, filthy. I can't believe you didn't. That's all that. But everybody, by the way, everybody legitimately has a different idea about clean. My wife's concept of a clean house for us is 100% different than mine. It's just night and day. It doesn't smell, I think it's okay.
Pieces in the back.
Well, see, when you're gonna say clean, okay, so, yeah. Now, you learn from experiences. So back when I was doing production, had a buyer and big backyard. And the sellers had these 3 huge labs. And what do they do in the backyard? They poop a lot. And there was dog poop all over the backyard. Now, fortunately, we had the experience. And so we put in the offer and required the seller to remove all the dog poop prior to closing. Otherwise, you know, if they closed night, it'd be stuff all over the backyard and the buyer's kids couldn't play in the backyard because I mean, it was all over the place. So, you know, you have such experience that make you really do it because people don't always think about that. People say, you know, well, I only said the house. They only, well, that's not what you said. You know, must clean. But that's what the seller's thinking as you go through that. You gotta do it. Anything else in paragraph 2? Remember, paragraph 2 is still the most expensive paragraph for agents. Why is it expensive for agents? Yeah, because the seller may take something that you're not supposed to take. And the buyer say, whoa, what's going on here? We're supposed to get that, whatever that is. It's always cheaper to buy a refrigerator than to defend a lawsuit you may or may not win. Yeah.
I got that right now. I closed our listing end of January. And we'd gone over those 2 paragraphs like crazy at the very beginning. I just always do. So then when the sellers moved out, they took a coat rack that was affixed to the line of the wall. You could tell the last paint colors of that. I said, why did you guys take whatever that was off the wall?
Do you have the seller?
I had the seller.
Okay.
She said, well, my brother made me that coat, so I'm taking it. Of course I'm taking it. Okay, but it was affixed to the wall and back at the beginning, I said, you know, anything you want to take, please let me know ASAP.
What did they say?
They said, look, we just gave them a refrigerator, they can be okay. So Jana is paying to come and paint that one wall.
Yeah. And then do people say, anything I can take a screwdriver to, I'm gonna take it, you
And
know?
then they say, I can help them.
Yeah.
About things, I'm like, oh.
Now, one of the things that you may not have done, because if you did a good job going through it with them. And you see, there's no way for the agent to know as you walk through a house, which things they say, I can't believe you thought I'd leave that. That's a family heirloom, whatever that is. Sometimes there's no way. So the only thing that you can do is a follow-up with an email, said, I just want to make sure there's really not anything, capital letters, underlined, italics, that you didn't tell me that you're really going to take with you.
So on the listing agreement, should we have them initial those 2 paragraphs?
You could.
Bottom of the page.
Yeah, you could, but it's going to be what's in the contract that really counts.
Yeah.
It's a good start. So, yeah, because paragraph 2 of the listing agreement is the same as what's in the contract. If it doesn't translate forward into the contract, then you've got a challenge. Look on the 3rd page of your handout in paragraph 3, sales price. What's going on here with dirty tricks and sales price?
And it's all cash.
Cash offer this last.
Yeah, because notice the new language. In paragraph 3A, where we really tried to clarify that this really is a cash transaction. That there's no borrowed money. We don't have a really good definition of cash. We've talked about in the contract, the sales price, cash forward does not include proceeds from borrowing of any kind or selling other real property except as disclosed in the contract. So the buyer could be getting money from the sale of their other property as the cash on this, but they'd have the sale of other property addendum, wouldn't they? And so otherwise disclosed in the contract. What we don't know is you got that $2 million line of credit at the bank, and that's what's going to use to buy this $500,000 house. Is that borrowed money?
Yeah.
I don't know. No, we don't know. We really don't know. We got attorneys on both sides of that. Line of credit, pull money out of your 401k. We're pretty clear because of the addition to the third-party financing addendum in paragraph 1G, where we talk about hard money financing. We're pretty sure that hard money financing is hard money, because we were having investors make this a cash transaction, but they were usually borrowing from a hard money lender.
And
So
then the lender backs out. And then the.
Buyers in default.
Yeah.
yeah, so it's little steps. It's a good step forward, but we still have to do all kinds of things as agents to really make sure. Certainly as the listing agent, if they've got, 400,000 in 3A and 400,000 in 3C, we need to really get serious on proof of funds. Our challenge of proof of funds, there's no standard form. And just like we talked about fraudulent buyers, fraudulent sellers, fraudulent proof of funds happens all the time. Some of them don't even include somebody's name. It's just crazy. So we gotta really work through and deal with that.
Would you be willing to change paragraph 3B so that we can write in what the other funds are coming from? Because right now, all we can do is check third-party seller or loan assumption.
Well, and right now, these are the three types of funding, or three types of financing that we address in the third-party financing addendum, or loan assumption addendum, or seller financing addendum. So what is it you wanted to have?
Well, if they're getting, say, a gift or the money's coming from a 401k, on page or on paragraph 3B, where it just says third party, seller, whatever. Where else can we put any other type of?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm, it's those planning.
No, I don't either.
Fighting.
I'm just,
Fighting.
See, that's one of our problems is if you got something coming from family members, for example, that's not a loan, that's not, the key distinction between something that's a loan or not is there gonna be a lien attached to the property. But you're gonna tie the property as collateral to whatever the financing is. Yeah. But there is still a challenge on the types of that really qualify as financing or not financing, or cash or not cash. But at least there's an attempt there. We'll have some case studies, we'll have some test cases.
I'm listening.
Based on this. Okay. Thanks for being there. Appreciate you being here. Now, talk to me in paragraph 3, as we put sales price, cash financing, sales price. Tell me about emotions. Yes, ma'am.
Some people get, a lot of sellers get not talked to appropriately, get all caught up in whatever that number is. It shows up as the sales price.
Yep.
And they don't take into account, they must pay for title, we pay for survey, they want. Like all.
Never thought we'd
that-
get that much. My God, can't believe we got that much. Boy, you must be a great agent. 50,000 more than what we've ever thought we'd get. And that gets very emotional. How about sellers reacting to a cash offer? Yeah. And so one of the reasons that, particularly investors, but one of the reasons that buyers make cash offers from a emotional standpoint, we know that's more attractive. We know that they feel better about it. And you're making use of that. Now, and we actually had 2 classes here over the last 2 years dealing with what do we do if there's a change in the source of funds going towards closing.
The closing table.
Do what?
Say if it's something that
Yeah.
changes, like you sign it at the closing table, not
Yeah.
before then.
If everybody agrees to it, you can do, an amendment, mutually agree to and change everything because at closing, it's all cash and seller anyway. And technically, it doesn't really matter where it came from. But everybody has to agree to that. And one of the things that we talked about in those classes is that if we get to closing, and if the buyer doesn't do what they really should do, once they determine that they're not gonna do cash, that they're gonna do FHA conventional like that, once they decide that, they really should go through the process and make the request of the seller to amend the contract, to add to it a third-party financing them, to change those parts of the contract that financing will reflect, change paragraph 3, for example, paragraph 22, list third-party financing. That's ideally the way it should be, because that way the seller can say, okay, because sometimes there are very valid reasons why that would change. And so somebody say, okay, that's fine, so we make the change and move forward, everybody knows what we're doing. But if they don't do that and they wait to closing, and the buyer says, the reason we need something to be amended at closing is our lender requires it. And most of the time, 90% of the time, easily, the buyer's lender is going to require that the contract reflect the financing. And so the buyer's lender says, yeah, we got to add third-party financing, then we got to change the numbers in the contract. Which means the buyer's going to submit a correct promulgated amendment to the seller. The seller says, no. You cannot require the other party to agree to amend the contract. And the seller says no, because he's got a backup better than this one anyway, plus he doesn't like these buyers. He said no. And he can't make it. This deal fall apart because the buyer's lender said, no, if this doesn't get done, we're not gonna fund the loan, and now the buyer's in default. So while this happens most of the time, and it was rare because it closed, the seller said, okay, I still get my money, okay, we're fine. But they don't have to. If they choose not to, then this deal's dead. Cynthia's giving me that look like.
No, not at all, I agree.
Yes, sir.
I was gonna ask, because that's a positive with the sales price being higher.
Yeah,
What if the sales price is lower than what the seller is expecting to sell?
yeah. Then he may just choose not to finish, say, let's not close and just put this house back on the market and help me, I can get what I want. Absolutely. Because he doesn't have to agree to amend. In fact, he's been frustrated the whole time. He says, I really never should agree to this. I
Right.
can't believe my agent let me agree to this. Just unhappy. And finally, when he finds out at the last minute that he doesn't have to still agree with it, he kill it and move on, he may say, oh, good, I'm gonna do that. So the agent better make sure, if this is gonna happen at closing, the listing agent better make sure they help the seller understand their rights. Here's what you can do, here's what you don't have to do. And helping them understand that's really key. You work through it. All right, good sense? Okay. Paragraph 4, leases. Great paragraph. I'm sorry, pardon me?
I say manipulation.
Yeah, what about manipulation on sales price?
Because one of the tricks I was using during the Hunger Games of real estate a year or two ago was, my clients, we were always putting, we weren't going all cash. We were putting down, we were reflecting that we were doing a much higher down.
So you may reflect 20% down when they weren't gonna do it. Yeah, yeah.
401k,
Sure.
leaving it out, but at the closing table, it might have only been 10 or 20%.
Yeah.
But we were reflecting a much higher down payment, which is still not a bad tactic to use today, but it is manipulating.
Does this come, Holly, does this come to intent? If you think about it, manipulation, this is intent. If the buyer says, hey, let's put in there 50% down, because I can prove up money for that. There's no way I put 50% down. And from day one, their intent was not to put that down. Well, one, they're lying to the seller. And when the seller looks at that offer, he's looking at 5 offers. Here's one of them. He says, wow, look how much you're putting down. That's great. Sometimes a buyer is going to close with bigger down, and they're putting a bigger down because it's the only way they can get approval is by putting a large down. So that intent comes into play, and they weren't just like, they were lying about the cash offer that they knew were gonna close with financing. And that's manipulation, and it's also emotion, because we see how the sellers react to large down payments, cash transactions, we see how the seller views those, and it makes a huge difference. Okay, so help me out a little bit with this, Holly. Are you saying that you were helping the buyer intentionally lie about what they were gonna do? Well, okay, everybody, shh. I need to make sure I hear the answer. Don't play politics. Help me with the answer. What's your answer to my question? Are you intentionally helping the buyer lie about what they were gonna do?
It's their decision.
Just to make their offer more attractive, so it'll be accepted?
I've laid out their options, and at the end of the day, it's their choice of what they want to put down. And what they can prove they have. Now, if they change their mind somewhere along the process with their lender, for whatever reason, then that's on them.
Yes, I did scroll by. So here's our challenge here. Here's our challenge. And it gets down to intent. Buyer needs to know what their choices are, you know what their options are. If the buyer legitimately says, yeah, I can close on this deal 50% down. I can close on this cash deal, I've got the money. And then things happen, and that was their original intent. Things happen that, what we saw a number of times, the cash deal. Buyer made $800,000 cash offer into a contract. He's at lunch one day visiting with his tax attorney. The tax attorney, you did what? Are you stupid? You're putting that kind of cash? You know what the interest rates are today? And you're spending that much cash? What are you? He said, wow, I really thought about it. And so after the conversation with his tax attorney, he says, yeah, I guess I really should change it. I mean, I really, should close on finance, because look at how much I can borrow, and I'm certainly financially capable. Look what I can borrow, put 20% down and save all that. So that'd be a good idea. So sometimes there's a legitimate reason. The original intent was a cash transaction or was a large down payment. Where we get into trouble, Holly, is when from day one, they were lying. Just to make the seller accept the offer. That's wrong. And here's what happens in this small real estate world. People know that's what you do all the time. And it impacts on that offer, comes to a listing agent. Yeah, I've heard this before.
Every holiday listing agents always have multiple offers.
Oh, well, always, yeah. So the reality is, on the one hand, Holly is right. You give them their options, you give them their choices, and they get to decide what they're gonna do. What you've got to do is decide, are these people lying? Or is this an intentional misinformation, misrepresentation of the other side just to get the deal? We saw on a lot of different levels this. So you've got to decide, if they're lying about this, what else are they lying about? They're lying to you about, whatever. It's just like when things were hot and heavy and big multiple offers, and a challenge buyers kept losing deals. And they looked for just, is there anything I can do to get my offer accepted? In fact, they found themselves no longer was the highest priority the perfect house. The highest priority is let's get into a contract. On anything, let's get into a contract. And they would find themselves accepting things and doing things, that they wouldn't normally do. Part of that is just the nature of the environment that we were in at that time. People were doing things that, it's just, yes, ma'am.
Like going in with a conventional loan and switching to an FHA.
Sure.
But the appraisal.
Yeah.
With the
No
conventional.
longer can have the appraisal. That goes. Yeah. When you shift from conventional to FHA, if you use that addendum for appraisal, it's gone. You have to delete that. Just go away.
But we weren't shifting from it whatever we were paying. I mean.
Oh, I understand that. You were just lying from day one. I understand that.
Who's looked at the percentage of what the person actually puts down, because they don't really know at the end of the day.
Yeah.
What the buyer is putting down
Sure.
percentage wise. I mean, they see it in the contract, but at the end of the day, we don't know ever.
Yeah, and it's a good point.
Be quite honest.
It's a good point, and it does,
It's-
and it doesn't have anything to do with lying or whatever, that a seller, if we start off with 20% down or 50% down, they can close at 5% down. There's nothing, they are not required to amend the contract to change from 20% down to 5% down. Unless the lender requires it. Most of the time they won't in that circumstance. So the seller is gonna get cash at closing anyway, regardless of where it comes from. Sean?
So are you? How do you deal with someone going from a conventional to an FHA?
Okay. So in the classes that we I'm dealing with that. In fact, I've got a whole, I think it's about a 6-page document that I created that addresses that. And I did a thing, I guess, for CCAR. First thing is when the seller is changing financing. One of the things you've got to do, and this falls right under dirty tricks, so you've got to decide what's going on. This is the first of many little tricky steps here, you know, where we got going. Because there is a procedure, there's a process there. And the underlying requirement is it has to have mutual agreement. It's worth it. Now, it's especially a challenge when you go from conventional to FHA because of the mandatory clause. FHA and VA are going to require the mandatory clause. So the buyer's lender is going to say, we've got to have this, which is going to require the buyer and the seller agent to sign off on it. You can't make the seller sign off on it because that wasn't part of the original contract. So the buyer would go through the process and make a request to the seller and say, I need to change from conventional to FHA. That's going to change paragraph 3. That's going to change paragraph 2. That's going to change the third-party financing addendum. We're going to do all those things. The seller says, okay, that's fine. You know, it's all cash me closing anyway. I don't care. Although the seller will have a conversation with the listing agent who said, okay, here are the differences, particularly from conventional to FHA or VA. There can be some differences in what happens in the appraisal. There'll be a different appraisal than it is a conventional appraisal, different VA appraisal than it is in the FHA or conventional appraisal. There could be some additional repairs requested, especially in VA than in conventional. So there are potentially some differences there, but the ultimate terms of the contract, closing date, for example, that doesn't change. Some of the other things that are going on here will stay the same. The total amount of the sales price, what you get closing, that's going to all change. It's just you're creating some new contingencies for a buyer they didn't have yesterday. And so sellers got to make a decision, am I willing to do that? But it's going to require the parties to do the proper paperwork, and require the listing agent and the buyer's agent to understand here are the points in the contract that this affects, have to be changed. Paragraph 3, paragraph 22, third-party financing, those all have to be changed. And your understanding that says, here are the steps, here's how we go through the process, but the underlying principle that no one is required to agree to amend the contract. So it says, you know what? At 5 offers, I accepted you because it's conventional with large down payment. If that's not what it is, then you need to go away. I'm not going to amend anything. I'm not going to do it. And because you're still in the option period, this is a great time for you to terminate this contract and move on because I'm not going to change it. And then they have a decision about it. Look at that process. Does that make semi-good sense? Yes, ma'am. Janet?
Where our value proposition comes into play, because people wonder, what exactly are we doing to get paid what we get paid? So on my either buyer appointments or seller appointments, I let them know, I'm not just watching you, my client. I'm watching the other agent, the other, person who's in the principal, the title company, the lender. I'm watching a whole bunch of people, not just you, and I always call a lender when somebody changes their style of financing, because I want to know why they switched from.
Not just the style, but they changed lenders. There's nothing in the contract that identifies a lender except for a third or money lender. In one G.
I still wonder why they had.
So she's right. This is an important part of the value proposition that you have. I've mentioned several times. You're aware of these principles. You're aware of these things in the contract. You're aware of how these can be used. You look at the intent of how it goes with it. So that when you've got the seller, you've got the listing, and the offer is from one of Holly's buyers. So, but he's right, value proposition.
It's always, I mean, it was a tax. And they could.
That doesn't help your case.
Manipulation, and I was.
Yes, you are, and that is, and that can well be, you're exactly right, I agree with it. So, but we do see in paragraph 3, all the things that could happen in dirty tricks. And your job as a listing agent, because these dirty tricks are being done by the buyer and buyer's agent going through the process. And as a listing agent, it's determine what's really going on here. It's not automatically a killer that the buyer is going to putting in the offer, that you're going to make a down payment, big down payment. You got to get proof of funds. You say, you know what, it's otherwise a good offer. You know, what's the problem here? Particularly when you've got a seller who is not just selling property, buying other properties, doing the same thing on the house they're buying. You know, yeah, I understand that. That's a good technique. We do that all the time. Not a problem.
If I'm the listing agent, it's also, I can do that, like, ask the other agent, if I'm accepting suppose the cash or convention. So make sure that, you're not gonna change it. I mean, you can find all.
Well, not anything you can do to keep it, not anything you can do to keep it from changing.
Yeah,
All the
I
seller can do is not agree to the request for a change.
Yeah.
You can't require the other, there's not anything, even the attorneys won't help you do this. You can't put anything in paragraph 11, special provisions, where the parties agree to not make any changes to the contract. You cannot make a promise on a future event. The court won't enforce a contract with that. What you can do is make sure your client understands, if the other side requests change, I'm not required to agree to it. And that keeps your client in control. Otherwise, you can do. A lot of stuff in paragraph 3, and it's like a nice, simple little paragraph as you work through it. Let's look at paragraph 4. Leases. Great paragraph, because we should have always been talking about leases and fixture leases and residential leases. Now it's in the contract, so we're going to talk about it. So it's already there. A lot of room for manipulation as you go through the situation. They've added to in dealing with residential leases. Oral leases, same thing with fixture leases, oral fixture leases, which they didn't have before, it was just written before. Your challenge gets to in both areas, and this is when it gets to, you've got to determine the intent here is you've got the buyer, and the area we have this problem with are solar panels. And the solar panels are leased. And the seller says, at this contract price, at closing, I'll pay off the solar panels at closing, out of the proceeds of the sale. Well, in the fixture leases addendum, we don't address that. It's not there. Somehow the buyer's got to make a decision to determine that the seller really will, at closing, that they'll pay off those solar panels, that that'll be done. And that at closing, because technically in paragraph 9, the closing paragraph, seller agrees to transfer without any, assumptions, any interest, any liens, anything against property. So they agree that they'll do that. But the buyer, on the buyer side, we've got to decide, the seller agreeing to do that just so, because the buyer made a great offer, it's a great contract. You've got to prove up and seller has the ability to do that. Do they have the money? Is there enough equity there? Is there enough going on that they can do it at closing? Otherwise, buyer closes on that thing and this doesn't get resolved at closing. They're now sitting there with solar panels on their house, and a solar panel people can come out and take it.
Wouldn't that be considered a business detail?
It could be a business detail, because it really impacts. I think it's right on the line. I think it could slip over a little bit into
I don't mind
legal rights.
I don't mind being.
You don't mind doing without mine. You leave it at the jump rope. It's a jump rope.
Now we know. I have gray hair. I dye myself to get that distinguished look. Is it working? Okay.
Business detail with me.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because here's the rule. If you're gonna do something in the contract or in the offer that you think is a business detail, what do I want you to do? Now, in your case, you can call Marcia, and Marcia say, we need to talk about that.
I'll answer shop.
Whatever that first shot as you work through. Because it could be, but there's some, particularly solar panels is our big example. But as you work through that process, we have those kinds of situations, and it's easy for somebody to want us to get into a contract. And you could have, and for example, at least, fixtures, maybe the seller owns them. But how do they own them? Do they get a lien from their bank, credit line from their bank to pay for the solar panels or whatever the fixture is? Is there a security interest against it? A lot of stuff, we got to research, because one of the things that's kind of happened in spite of how hard the solar panel people have worked to make everybody feel better about solar panels and all that kind of stuff. It really is a challenge, and most sellers out there have come to recognize it's not a plus to have solar panels.
Unless they're already paid off.
If they're already paid off, and if there are no other maintenance contracts, anything else, if there are warranties, because you do have maintenance issues, but Holly's right. If there's any kind of a lease, and there's a not a new thing, but it's a thing that's not a lease, it's called a purchase agreement. And what you're literally purchasing, the electricity. And it's horrendous. It's a terrible thing to have. But some sellers have agreed to that. So we need to make sure as we work through that, because we've got these addenda, we need to make sure we understand what's in those two addenda, the residential lease addendum and the fixed lease. Where we get into trouble with the residential lease is you've got a tenant in there, a legitimate tenant, who's got a written lease, and you're going to close in March, and the lease is going to be up in April. And the seller said, not a problem. They're going to move out. They'll be out of here before closing. We're going to give them an early release on the lease, and so everything is good. Well, what's the buyer's problem? Yeah, what if they don't? Is this where they just telling us that to get into the deal? You got to make sure, and the only way you can really make sure at some level, two things. One, I was going to talk to the tenant to find out what's really going on here. And we said, I'm going to do what? Oh, yeah. Right. We wanted to extend the lease, so you go through that. And second, you require, and this would be attorney language, it's not business detail. You require that the seller resolve their residential lease and sometime prior to closing. You don't want to just do it 2 or 3 days before closing. You give enough time so the buyer can assure that the lease has been terminated and the tenant's been released and the tenant's gone. And have a vacant property. You don't get that done and you close on it without making sure that tenant's gone and the lease is terminated, the buyer is now responsible for the property go for that tenant and the lease and the security deposit. You don't need for your buyer to get a call the week after closing when the tenant says, okay, we finally moved out and we just need our $5,000 security deposit now. If you correctly use the addendum, that would have been paid to the buyer at closing. It didn't get done because, oh, don't worry about it. They're going to leave before, and so we won't have to worry about this at closing. We'll leave before and we're going to pay the security deposit, everything's good. Sometimes they're doing it because they don't know better, but more often they're doing it because they're lying to you. So you got to pick up on no. Yes, ma'am.
Don't forget to remind everybody about how hard eviction court is. They need to be out before the final offer.
Yeah.
Before they close.
Yeah, it's a good point. Evictions are a real mess. Depends on which county you're in, as you know, but it's a real challenge, and your client doesn't want to be in the middle of all that. So, exactly right. Is everybody good with leases? Good with all that? It's a lot of opportunity there. Your familiarity with the terms of the leases, the fixture leases addendum, and the residential lease addendum are critical because it has responsibilities for the seller and rights of the buyer, termination rights of the buyer that you should be familiar with. So when the other side is promising certain kinds of things, really. Paragraph 5. What's paragraph 5 deal with? Earnest money and options, right? Choice of title company, right? What's our dirty trick situation here? First of all, with the title company.
Negotiable.
Negotiation for the title company. Why do we care who the title company is?
I'm regretting mine right now.
Why?
Because some title companies suck.
Some of them are terrible.
Yes, they're terrible.
Absolutely are.
Yes.
And some of the worst out there do a lot of business with builders,
Build it, yeah.
and we don't get a lot of good service. Where you been, James Dean? Where you been?
No one called, I told, are we going on holiday or something?
If there are still some documents there, grab the documents, sit down and be quiet. This is James E. McLeod, one of our good friends from the office. He's actually up in Salina. He's one of the investors in the Salina KW. And always happy to see him. So close the door.
Well, I may not be able to stay long. I
It's
don't.
okay. I'm glad to see you come by.
Glad to see you too.
The stage we've been having to talk about you behind your back. So in paragraph 5, the negotiation with the title company, what can be going on the listing side that is misinformation, is manipulative about the title company? What could be happening?
They could say, we've already opened title, so it has to stay.
Yeah. And this happens. Now, are there good reasons why they've opened title? Absolutely. What you've got to do on the buyer side is what? You've got to ask, why have you opened title?
It's an estate and somebody.
It's a state, or you've already opened title, the first deal fell apart.
Or my client is,
Yeah, like one of the owners of the title company.
or my client, I have a client who's, maybe it's all published, because people that are in like places in government and.
Yeah, sure,
Sure, so.
And sometimes they're a legitimate reason, but you need to know what they are. Because they're using that to manipulate the use of a certain title company. Builders do it all the time.
It's what happens to me also, like the builders, title company. It's like, it's supposed to be neutral. It was always working for another. And I
Yeah,
had,
absolutely.
the next time, when I used that builder, I got my buyers different title company. It was fine.
Good. It is a challenge.
Question,
Do what?
then you get the question. The seller has the title company written down, buyer comes in and says, but we want this title company.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Right,
Okay,
so as our comment to them is, so are you telling me the buyer is paying for title? For the title policy?
Or the seller, yes,
So,
seller, yeah, the seller's gonna pay for it. If they want to use their title company, it's legitimate for you to ask them, says, they'll pay for it.
Yeah.
Because section, RESPA you cannot require a buyer to purchase a particular provider. You require. However, having said that, if a seller says, if you don't use my title company, I'm not gonna accept your offer. The seller's not required to accept your buyer's offer. They may be looking at 2 or 3 different offers, and yours is the only one that didn't use their title. So buyer has to make a decision. Now, the challenge really is not between the buyer and seller, it's the agents.
Right.
The agent won't create the problem. And you have to be careful with the agent, particularly the listing agent who's pushing this. He says not only is the buyer going to pay for it, because that's what the seller is going to require to get a better net, but they're going to use our title. Now, if it's any of the major retail title companies, we're setting aside the whole builder. But any of the major retail title companies, Republic, Chicago, Allegiance, I'm gonna include trust in part of this, because I like trust title. It doesn't matter. You're gonna get the same service, they're a neutral third party, they're gonna do a good deal. Some of the little fee attorney offices really make me nervous. But if it's a good major retail title company, not a problem. And the only reason that there's a push for one over the other is the agent feels like they owe the people at that title company, oh yeah, they bought our lunch, or they came to our office, or they're whatever. But it's very easy for the title company to be a dirty trick and for you to use that to manipulate, even to some degree emotions as you work through it. But if you've got we have, for example, seller, we had the buyer tell them when you use our title company, and the buyer said, well, why? He said, well, because his wife is a closer to that title company. And buyer had to think about that and says, and he had to decide if that's a good thing or not a good thing. And he said, well, I want to beat her. which is, by the way, kind of unusual, but I think was a good idea. So he got to meet her and make the decision, that's okay, this will be a good transaction. We feel like it, you know, in spite of a situation where there'll be certain pressure on her part to get this thing closed because it's her husband. Okay, coming. Buyer said, yeah, we're okay. But the key is the buyer knew about it. The buyer, it was explained to him, here's why we're going to use this title company. There's a relationship here. This is what it is. So buyer, how do you feel about that? And so when you go through that process, you deal with it and they can make a good decision. And it's no longer that manipulation, it's no longer that misinformation. And that because you went through the process, gained good information and you dealt with it. That make good sense? Anything else in the paragraph 5, title policy? There's some other factors here. Well, John?
So I guess my question is if the listing agent, I mean, there's on the MLS, a title listed. What is the benefit?
Preferred title company, yeah.
Preferred title company. What is the thought process on the buyer agent or the buyer side that they want to go with their title company?
Yeah, if the buyer wants to use their title company, again, there needs to be a reason. You need to ask your buyer, says, okay, why do you prefer this title company? And they may have a relationship with that title company, and there may be valid reasons, or they may say, you know what? It's not so much I want to use this title company, it's just I will not use that title company, the one the seller is preferred. And here's why.
Well, the reason why I asked that is because I had 2 offers come in on my listing and different agents, but it was the agent's choice about the title company that.
Oh, it's almost always, buyers and sellers don't know. It's almost always the agent, which doesn't matter. I mean, the agent shouldn't be doing that. They do. They have their title company that they've got a relationship with, they get great service from. And because you know that, and they're manipulating a little bit, going through that process. On the listing side, you need to decide, regardless of what the buyer's agent is wanting, how do we feel about it? Do you, the listing agent, and your seller feel good about that title company? So if the buyer's agent says, well, we want to use Allegiance, and you said, well, I'd rather use Trust or Republic or whatever, then you need to decide how much of a problem is it going to be for Allegiance. If you feel challenged with it or your seller feels challenged with it, you just have to make that decision.
To me, it just depends on the whole situation. If it's been on the market 3 days and it's offered, you better go with what they have. If it's been on the market 4 days.
If this is a hard property to sell, you're gonna do whatever. You're gonna work with it. You're just glad somebody showed up and you hope they close. Work through that. Okay, the other thing in paragraph 5, earnest money. What can be happening with dirty tricks for earnest money?
They don't turn it in.
They may not turn it in, and it can be a problem. James?
I was gonna say that.
Yeah. What about the amount of the earnest money? You know, we went forever. And it was a standard number, 1% sales price. You could almost create a stamp and put in there, 1% sales. And the market changed, and that changed. And earnest money began to be a lot more because of the competitive market and multiple offers and all those kinds of things. It's backed off a little bit, but it's still a higher number most often. How can the amount of the earnest money be used as perhaps misinformation, maybe even manipulating a little bit, making the seller feel better about this buyer because of the amount of the earnest money?
The same emotion as putting in a cash offer.
Yeah, maybe it's like a cash. And does it really matter how much?
If there's an option period, it doesn't matter.
Option period, sell disclosure notice, major HOA.
If there's an out, if there's.
If they're out, James?
You get out, it doesn't matter.
Uh-huh,
I
James?
think you guys are story one. I believe you years ago, when you had a buying like a $350,000.
Yep, cash deal, and he put up 300,000 earnings.
Maybe allowed him in the.
And it blew the seller away.
Yeah.
So this guy is, I mean, okay, one of the questions you ask on a cash deal, where is the money right now? Where is that 300,000 today? Well, he put up 300,000 earnest money, it's the title company right now. So, so he made use of the amount of earnest money to get a deal over other deals that were at a higher price because of the use of the earnest money. Exactly right. And so you can use that in such a way to really influence the seller on your offer as you work through it. Now, the key is, you do need to understand, you see the language in paragraph 5, and 5C and 5D. If you're gonna put a large amount of earnest money in there, buyer's gonna have to pay it. If he doesn't pay it, he can be in default, the seller can come after him. Plus, the seller can have termination rights if they don't do it within that 3 days that you see the language in paragraph 5. Unlike an option fee, which a buyer doesn't necessarily have to pay, he just loses that termination option. If there's an earnest money issue, he has to pay it. Otherwise, you have a real problem. So I think the amount of the earnest money. Now, one of the things we don't know, and it's part of your job, so I pay you the big bucks, is to get a sense for if you have a seller, how important is that to the seller? So it says, why do I care how much earnest money you pay? What's gonna be your answers? What's gonna be your answer? Your seller says, why am I even concerned with how much earnest money they're paying?
How serious they are.
More attractive.
Well, we do look at how earnest they are, call earnest money, how serious they are. As they work, how much skin they got in the game. Our doctor, and it was the doctor who made that $300,000 earnest money. Somebody said, man, that's a lot of money at risk. I said, no, if I put 10,000 up, that's a risk. 300,000 will be poor before you get that. You're not getting by 300,000. So there's not a lot of risk there. But it does show how serious you are as you work through it, as long as the seller doesn't overthink it. You know, if I've got one offer over here on a $400,000 property, and this guy over here is putting up 4,000, this guy's putting up 10,000, that's not a huge difference. That's not a big deal. You know, if everything else in the offer is equal, you might go with the larger earnest money. But we don't know how important the earnest money is. Just like the option fee. We don't know how important the option fee is to a seller. And it depends, you know, but one of the things we recognize, unlike the old contracts, which had 2 boxes you could check off, where the option fee was credit sales price or not, here it's automatically credit. So the seller doesn't really get the option fee unless the buyer terminates. Otherwise, it's going to be credited at closing, so he never sees that. He doesn't get that paid. It's going to be at the title company. So it's not paid directly to the seller. So one of the things that we see with option fees is the seller says, well, we want to make sure that this is a serious buyer. We've got that a little bit because he put up a good earnest money. But he's got a 5-day option period and he put up $10 in an option fee. It's not a lot of risk there. It's not a skin game. You know what's going on. And then you look at other things in the contract, other rights of termination they have. So the option doesn't matter. Now, one of the things that happens with the option period that could be a little deceptive is buyer makes an offer without an option period. That can make use of a little deception here. And a seller may say, wow, it's a better offer. They're not looking for this automatic way to get out. These people are really committed. Really? Doesn't mean that, does it? Like they may really be using that as technique, especially if it's on a major HOA. Because they don't need that option period, do they?
Except. If the listing agent gets the HOA, blah, 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 information and downloads it.
You've got a minimum of a 3-day option period. Depending on which choice you have in major HOA. But as you look through that, sometimes buyers and buyer's agents use the lack of an option period to make it look like a more attractive offer. And it may or may not be. So we need to make sure we look at the emotion of that and how our seller interprets it. And if he says, yeah, that's great. Yeah, maybe not. We would like to. In fact, one of the things that we had when the market was hot and heavy and crazy is that buyers would, AT&T says their stuff has been restored. We'll see. As buyers were putting up option fees that would not be created the sales price, which means I actually had to put language in paragraph 11. It will not be created the sales price, which means when the buyer puts up a $500 option fee, that's a bribe to the seller. If you'll accept my offer, here's $500. Do with whatever you want, because it won't go to anything at closing. It's $500 you get right now, and it's yours. And that's literally a bribe to the seller. And a really competitive situation, When a buyer puts up something like that to the seller, it can really impact on them. The seller has that money regardless of what happens in the transaction. Seller has that money. Doesn't go to anything at closing, doesn't get credit or anything. Seller just got $500 for into a contract with that buyer. Question? If I got a question, Jeannie?
I'm gonna start looking for more earnest money on the selling side, because that one that.
On the listing side?
On the listing side.
Why?
That one that is almost closed last week.
Yeah,
If my client had to get an attorney, what's $5,000 gonna get him, really? I mean, if the title company won't release the earnest money without the buyer signing. I mean, I think that's a real problem.
yeah, it's an interesting challenge. One of the things I think to the point that Jeannie's bringing up is that when we deal with amounts of earnest money and we find ourselves having to deal with a dispute between the buyer and the seller, we know the title company's gonna hold on to it. If you have a large amount of earnest money, because right now the small claim court action is 20,000, it bumps it up to 20,000. So that if you've got 10,000 in earnest money, that may well be worth going to small claims to deal with it. If you've got 500, it's not worth going to court even with small claims. So having a larger amount, if there's a dispute, it also gives the two sides a little bit more ability to split the difference and to settle something and work it out. So I think for a little bit of that reason, if that's what you kind of were talking about, I think a larger amount of earnest might make a difference. Yes, ma'am.
And can you make it abundantly clear again that you cannot have an extended option period without some level of consideration?
Yeah, in paragraph 6 of the Trek promulgated amendment, that's where you extend the option. It's got a place in there for the option fee, which unlike the contract, that extension for an option period is paid to the seller, not the title company. And the reason for that is it's a small amount, but it has to be something. It's typically $1, $5, $10, something like that. And whether or not the buyer actually pays it or not, doesn't matter unless the buyer is going to terminate during that extended period. But if they don't pay something to the seller, they don't have that extension. They don't have that right. They have to pay something. Yes, sir.
There's no time frame on that extension.
You know, you're exactly right. They're talking about trying to go and put it in there. What the attorneys tell us, even the Texas Worker attorneys say, that they're treating it as the same time frame as in the contract, 3 days, which is kind of silly. It's what if you're only extending it 2 days? Doesn't matter. But it really only matters if you're going to terminate during that time frame. Virginia's right, you've got to pay something. Now, we're not going to tell them, yeah, $1, that's fine. We don't know. That's called nominal consideration. We don't know if that's sufficient or not, but we do say you've got to pay something. Yes, ma'am. Follow up.
Yeah, a transaction I just closed last month, the buyer's agent put in 0, but to add on 3 days.
Yeah.
When I said you can't do that, you gotta put in something, he said, well, I've seen it all a bunch of different ways, so it's okay.
So
I said,
looking at the 3 lying misinformation, manipulative emotion, when you have this a lot. Oh, we do that all the time. Like, and your point is what?
yeah,
You're stupid all the time? You're wrong all the time? And somehow you're seeing that as a reason why it's okay for you to do it? Oh yeah, I do it all the time. You just admitted to me you're stupid all the time? Just remember, there's a rule about stupid. You can't fix it. You can't fix.
There's a lot of it.
It is what it is. You just deal with it, so. But you see all what can be done in paragraph 5, and dealing with the dirty tricks and all those kinds of things. Paragraph 6. One of the great things that we have in the contract is it really kind of tells you what's going on. Paragraph 6 deals with title policy survey and a lot of things in 6E1 through 11. One of the big things we got in paragraph 6 is we got paragraph 6A8, which deals with amending the survey exception, and we've talked about it in classes. This is a small thing, but if the buyer is going to receive an existing survey from the seller, the buyer should always amend this exception and have the title company behind the survey. Because if the buyer doesn't have the title company behind the survey on an existing survey, if there are mistakes on the survey, the buyer has no recourse. And go to anybody. Because the survey was not made for that buyer, it's an existing survey, he had everything. James?
Would you mind sharing with the class what they should look for on the survey?
What do you mean what they should look for? I don't like for agents to be looking at surveys. They look for easements.
Well, what I'm saying is, I've had one recently, but an existing survey, which happened to be a preliminary plan, had all the mentions about surveyor information.
One certified survey with a stamp on it. But it didn't qualify for just survey under paragraph 6C1 or 6A. So either one of them, you're right. Here's our challenge with surveys. On existing surveys, an existing survey has to be accepted by the title company, the buyer and lender, not the buyer. So the title company and the buyer's lender have to approve it, and there's no magic number of how many years it's old, how legible it is or is not, for them to determine that. The vast majority of the time, as long as the title company is okay with it, the lender doesn't care. He says, okay, I get a mortgage policy, right, good, so we don't really care one way or the other as you deal with it. But when you go through the challenge here, if you've got a seller who's providing an existing survey, in my little humble opinion, I think that's a little bit manipulative. Because it encourages the buyer to accept this existing survey, which the buyer should never do. The buyer should always get a new survey. All that should be negotiating the transaction is who's going to pay for it. 6C2, buyer's going to pay for it. 6C3, seller's going to pay for it. The buyer should not take an existing survey. If they do, they should always amend the exception. So if there are mistakes on the survey, they've got somewhere to go. Otherwise, they shouldn't. On any level at all. And I understand I've got a bias towards surveys and existing surveys because I've had problems with those. And surveys that are done today, probably over the last 5 years, there are problems because the technology has improved so much. But surveys that are 10 years old or older, all over the place, particularly when you get to acreage. You're challenged with acreage, and the reason, most buyers and sellers of acreage deal with existing surveys is because surveys are expensive, thousands of dollars. And the timeline is a real challenge. So under those circumstances, they say, I know what Bob says, I understand why he says it. It's usually $3,000 for a new survey, and we can't negotiate that in this transaction, so we're gonna do existing and hope everything's okay. And if you got a 15-year-old existing survey for, 50-acre tract, you got all highly potential challenges. And you better get that anyway.
How do you handle that with new construction when the builder is giving a new survey?
I'm saying it again.
How do you handle that situation of a buyer getting a new survey with a builder who gives?
Because often the builder is not actually a survey, it's a building flat. It's not really a survey. If it's a true survey on new construction, I'm okay with that. Because that new survey is going to actually come out in the name of the buyer. The survey is done, it's going to be in the name of the new owner.
But if there's an error in it?
Well, if there's an error in it and you did 6C1, 6A8, you got the exception. First of all, you have recourse against the surveyor because your name's going to be on it. Second, you can go to the title company, file a claim. So you've got some protection there. So it's a good point on builder survey, if in fact survey. Too often, it's not a survey. It's flat. It's a builder's flat, not a certified survey. So you need to be really careful. It doesn't meet the requirements in the language in paragraph 6C. So you want to be careful as you work through that. Yes, ma'am.
Paragraph 6, 8, the one about the,
Amending the exception.
can you clarify what all that really covers?
Yeah, all we're talking about here, is paragraph 6A, 6A 1 through 9, are the 9 exceptions to the title policy. Title company is saying to the buyer, you get these things resolved, Because if you got a problem with any of them after closing, don't call us, we can't help you. Those are exceptions. When you go to your title policy and you look at standard printed exception, that's a whole section of title policy. These 9 items are listed. Number 8, if you amend it, the language becomes, the only thing that you'll see there is the phrase shortages in area. And the title can be saying, all those other exceptions in 6A8, conflicts and boundaries, overlap intrusions, all those go away. They're no longer exceptions, but shortages in area, which is the exact square footage of the land, is still an exception. So buyer, if there's a mistake on the survey and your problem is the exact square footage of the land, we can't help. You can only go to the surveyor if it's a new survey. So when you make that change, when you amend it, what you're doing is you're saying all those other exceptions, overlapping encroachments, all those things, that I'm now covered for all those. So if there's a problem with those, if a mistake survey, I can file a claim to the top.
Better for the buyer.
Oh, absolutely.
I
better for
always
the
get
buyer.
that from my.
It's
buyer.
very cheap,
Yeah.
5% of the cost of the survey, I mean, of the title policy.
Yeah,
So $2,000 title policy, $100.
yeah,
Buyer should get it, buyer should pay for
yeah. That's what I
it.
do.
Especially on an existing survey. Because remember, buyer has no recourse on mistakes on existing surveys. He's got to get the title company behind it. He's got to do that. That help?
Yes.
You with that? Okay, so in paragraph 6, in dealing with the survey, 6D objections. What's a buyer doing in 6D that might be a little tricky, misunderstood, manipulative, whatever, in objections? An objections paragraph in 6D, in the big blank. What are they sticking in the big blank?
Well, if they added something that would give them an easy out, like they think it's.
It might, yeah. Like, they want to do the pool and backyard, detached garage, cabana. They want to, they want to use it for, temporary rental. Want to use it as investment property. Certain things buyer says, here's something I want to be able to do with the property. And if I can't do it, it's not that I can terminate, I can object. If the seller doesn't cure it, then I can terminate. And there are timelines in there. So the big blank is where the buyer is creating a basis, a right to object that they otherwise wouldn't have. Best example is buyer wants to build a in-ground pool, big backyard in-ground pool. And they don't put anything in the big blank. They get the survey and see all these easements running through the backyard. Hi, Marcia.
Hi.
We'll have him take good notes.
Oh, I'm sure.
See you Tuesday,
How many else take that together?
maybe. If I'm lucky. So easements are one of the things that you cannot object to. The buyer said, look at those easements. I can't build my pool. I object. Well, you don't get to. Unless in the big blank, the buyer said he wants to build a big in-ground pool. And he should have dimensions and all that. Then he has created a right to object he otherwise wouldn't have. So things that a buyer puts in there can be manipulative, can be tricky, and the seller needs to look at it and says what it is. Now, the seller needs to understand, as a listing agent, this is one of your value propositions. You understand the seller is not obligated to do anything.
Seller can't cure that easy.
Seller what?
Seller can't cure that easy.
Yeah, actually, they can. Easements can be cured.
Okay.
Easements can be moved.
Yeah.
Easements can be, and it might cost a lot of money, but they can. Even utility easements can be moved. But the big thing is sellers cannot and are not required to do anything. Buyer says, well, I want to do this and I put this in the big blank and I can't do it, so I object. Seller says, and you point us what? Object back. Do you still want to buy the house? Well, not if you don't cure this. Well, I'm going to cure it. And I don't have to. Seller doesn't have to do anything. He's got 15 days to decide if he wants to do anything or not. And so when the buyer puts something in there, the buyer may think that he's creating an obligation of the seller, and he's not. And
Protecting his earnest money. right?
all the buyer is really doing is protecting his rights to object that he otherwise wouldn't have. Any objection protects his earnest money. You're exactly right.
Creating a termination.
Creating a potential termination, because if a seller doesn't cure whatever the objection is, then you got a time frame, 15 days for the seller to cure or not cure, 5 days after that for the buyer to make a decision to terminate or not.
So a dirty trick would be do no option and put something in there.
Yeah. And increase your right to objection. You know, he wants to do something and maybe the city covenant doesn't allow it. Maybe there's setback line. Maybe there's an HOA, whatever. Maybe there's not an HOA. So the only right he's got is here. James?
I was just gonna say, if you knew the sort of the area and you knew there were issues that wouldn't allow it, you just put it in there and then leverage other negotiations. Or say, I'm out of here if you can't cure this objection,
Yeah.
knowing in advance that it
This
would.
becomes a trade-off. This becomes a leverage. That's one of the big things at Dirty Tricks is you're creating this over here. And you're saying, you know what, you knew this was an important thing to us. We still like the house, we like the neighborhood. We'll go along with this if. And there's something over here that you really wanted because you, from day one, you didn't care about this. You cared about this over here. You just weren't going to ask about it from day one. But you knew that the further into the transaction you can get, have the seller committed to doing the deal, more leverage the buyer has. Because the seller has got closing in their mind and money in their mind, and they're ready to go to closing, they're ready to get paid. And they begin to get a little bit more invested in having this deal close.
I told him here in the beginning, it's fine. I don't know that. This is.
I'm glad it's good stuff. It is good stuff so far, and we're about to run out of time. What we're gonna have to do is we're trying to kind of wrap up paragraph 6. Is it okay if we have a continuation to the next class?
Yes.
Because I've got further in the contract and I've got several select addenda that we need to touch on. But I want us to feel good about the concept of what we're talking about. Does it make sense, the concept, is this something that would be helpful to you to understand the concept?
Yeah.
And get to this concept. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned. Good to see you, James. Yes, sir. It's not even a dragon. Good, as an agent, you should explain that. Now you didn't sell. Good. It's your older friend, so they have to sell. Okay. So is the seller required? No.
It's all refused. But not all, and give.
Yeah. Not required. Some other writing. But just the fact that he didn't require the seller to be in the contract, so it's not required to, that doesn't give the buyer the right.
Yes.
That.
Also, people, man, this, why they treat you with pyramid or anything else? You have to say, well, if we don't get this done, right, well, you better have some reason to not close or you'll be in default. And so, yeah. And so we should. Okay, take care. It would be buyer's decision whether or not to reach it or not. And with the seller, probably just we send the insurance money, we're gonna sue you. But you didn't close, you'll be in default. Not only do we won't get this money, you didn't think prior credit. The buyer can make a decision, how hard they want to push it. And what the buyer would be, it would be reasonable for the buyer to look at their agent. Say, how come you didn't tell us the seller didn't have anything? And the day they say, what? Oh, and thank you, you got it. Yes. But see, this is where sometimes if you're hiring the seller are not getting along, like each other, then this further creates a problem. That's why it's so important to get them to work together to be in. But remember, legislative money is all up to. Yes, sir.
And anyway, I saw. So, I mean, this. There was things in a being Yeah. What's the part of it? It's